Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at the Economic Research Council, and we're very thrilled to have you here with us today for another enriching session in our series of economic discussions. Tonight, we're really privileged to host Professor Ramaa Vasudevan from the University of Colorado, and her expertise in the political economy of money and finance, especially as it relates to emerging markets, offers us a unique and insightful perspective on the complex dynamics shaping our global economy. The session will run with a 30 minutes talk by Ramaa firstly on the global dollar and financialization in the global south. And this will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. During this time, we encourage you to actively submit any questions that you might have using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and you don't need to wait till the end to do this. Before we do begin, I'd just like to draw your attention to an upcoming event in our calendar. On the 27th of February, we'll welcome Dr. Victoria Bateman, who will discuss the themes around how women made the West rich. And this promises to offer a fascinating exploration of the critical yet often undervalued economic contributions of women throughout history. And tickets for this event are now available online, so feel free to visit our website for more information there. Okay, thank you everyone once again for your presence and participation. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Ramaa.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen before I begin. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this and to the questions and answers. Now, in 1971, when right after the dollar was summarily delinked from gold, the Treasury Secretary of the US, John Connolly, remarked to the blindsided European finance ministers, the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. Now, many decades later, as the world was reeling from the aftershocks of the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, a top Chinese regulator, Luo Ping, protested at a BRICS meeting. We know that we would at a G20 meeting. We know the dollar is going to depreciate, so we hate you guys. But there's nothing much we can do except for the US Treasuries. What can you hold? So here's a nub. The dollar is the anchor of the global currency, but it creates problems. So you can see, even though the US share, the share in world trade and in global GDP is kind of 25%, 10%, in terms of anchoring payments, trade invoices, cross-border loans, and in particular, international debt securities and foreign exchange transactions, cross-border foreign exchange transactions, the dollar is dominant. So ever since the dollar was unpegged from gold and the Bretton Woods system, which had been established after the Second World War, was dismantled, the path was kind of paved for the global dollar emerging as the anchor of international liquidity. Now, US Treasury bills are the apex of the dollar system, but you have global private dollar mechanisms which have evolved outside the reach of the Fed and even outside the borders of the US, which generate liquidity globally. So the mechanisms that produce international dollar liquidity, they are cross-border. They involve both state and private actors. And most important, they are hierarchical. You settle debt or payments in terms of something which is above you, right? So what emerged after the kind of breakup of the Bretton Woods was not a genuine multilateral mechanism, but a full-fledged key currency system. Now, the Achilles heel of the system, the problem, which despite being an anchor, it is also in some senses a trap. One of the things which has been raised is the idea of the exorbitant privilege. right? And this is the idea that because the dollar is world currency, the US has an unlimited credit line. It can turn the tide of liquidity in its favor. And also, it is able to borrow at a lower rate than it lends. So what it's earning on its assets is more than what it's paying on its liabilities, right? Now, policy practitioners at the Bank of International Settlements, who really have their finger on the pulse, they pointed out that a chunk of global dollars is created outside the US, and it doesn't even flow through the US banking system. And what this implies is some senses that the rest of the world can supply itself with dollars and benefit from any favorable financing opportunities that this gives them. So the idea is to say, okay, there's exorbitant privilege is more spread out. The second problem is the idea, the sustainability or stability of the system, because it has been associated with what's called global imbalances, the persistent deficits, current account deficits that the US has, right? And does this in any way threaten the role of the dollar? Again, the practitioners of the PIs have pointed out that it's capital flows which is more important. The capital account is more important, not trade flows. And we saw already that in terms of financial foreign exchange transactions, they really dwarf trade flows globally. So what's been pointed out is that dollar liquidity is not circumscribed by the current account deficit at all. The flows are much more than trade flows. And the Federal Reserve has played a really kind of extraordinary role in 2008 when the financial crisis happened, and again in 2020 as the global pandemic hit. The US Fed was able to backstop the global domain of the dollar. There were extraordinary, unprecedented actions, and they worked to revive the financial system and the dollar mechanisms. So the US was able to lead and coordinate advanced capitalist countries in defense of the global dollar, and this has been critical. Okay, so third issue has to do with the fact that the mechanisms of the global dollar depend on large financial flows. And what it's done is it's created a global banking or a portfolio glut. So this growth, dollar liquidity is entwined in the excessive growth of cross-border financial flows. Dollar liquidity is not for trade, it's for financial transactions. And as transactions grow, the mechanisms of creating dollar liquidity have also evolved. And so this approach to looking at the financial system is it's called draws on the key currency approach, which goes back to Kindleberger and other who was writing about dollar crisis in the 70s. Now, the gold standard had a problem, which Keynes pointed out, that there was a deflationary bias. Any deficit country, a country which had a deficit, had to depreciate, contract in order to adjust its external balance. So there's an asymmetric burden placed on deficit countries. And this basically led to a deflationary bias in the system. Now, Keynes' proposal for the Bretton Woods was to internationalize the banking principle, borrow short and lend long, and do so through some supranational mechanism, which was not kind of subject to any kind of national priorities or interests. Now, the key currency system which has evolved is paradoxically a kind of internationalization of the banking principle based on a national currency rather than a supranational mechanism like Keynes had proposed. And the fact that the dollar is a key currency and its global dominance, it basically means that the US can be despite being a major deficit country, it can evade the need for deflationary adjustment to its deficit. And the excessive growth of private capital flows anchored on the dollar reinforce dollar dominance. So dollar dominance is in some sense entwined in the process of financialization. Now, what is financialization? It's this process by which financial modes of accumulation have become dominant. They become more important than investing in real productive capacity. So what this has led to is a social structure which is dominated by the power of finance, and in particular, global finance. Now, this system, which was kind of basically set in motion, or this process of financialization, which was set in motion in the post-Bretton Woods period, has gone through blips and crisis, but has also been very, very resilient. So within the key currency approach, and if you look at its analytical foundations, it's what's called the money view. What's key here is that there's a tightrope act which is being performed. You're balancing elasticity of payments with the discipline of funding. So why is elasticity needed? Transactional needs for dollars are rising. So you need to be able to supply or create dollars in response to those needs. What about discipline? Now, discipline ensures that payments are settled when they fall due. If settlement doesn't happen, that means you'll have a series of domino effects happening and the system will crumble. So you need both elasticity and discipline. Elasticity gives you a boom, while discipline leads to, taking away the punch bowl, basically. But this system is hierarchical, and the access to dollar liquidity is not equal across regions and entities. And here we come to the role of the Global South. Emerging market and developing economies have been anchored to this US-led financial system, anchored on the dollar, but they've been integrated in an asymmetric way. And key to this asymmetry is the fact that, given the subordinate nature of their currency, the fact that they are lower down in the hierarchy, these countries cannot borrow in their own currency. They have to borrow in the global currency in dollars. And this has been called the original sin of international finance. The fact that you cannot borrow in your own currency, you have to borrow in dollars. And this is key to financial subordination. And financial subordination basically has two aspects. One aspect has to do with the extraction of value. Subordinate countries are, they face a continuous outflow of revenues which is mobilized by global financial centers who have basically spread out globally in their search for returns. It also means a constriction of policy autonomy, because these countries become vulnerable to capital outflows and volatility of the financial markets. And that means the space for using policy for domestic priorities gets constricted. They are constantly trying to protect themselves from external shocks. Now, this issue is very vast, and what I wanted to do is go back to this key currency perspective and the idea of elasticity and discipline, and reframe it by linking it to this literature on financial subordination. Because when you look at it from this framework, what becomes clear is that the hierarchy of the system rests on the fact that the burden of discipline is falling disproportionately on the periphery, which acts like a safety valve or a shock absorber, while the benefits of the elasticity of payments accrue to global financial centers at the core, in the advanced capitalist core. So in some senses, the resilience of the dollar is drawing on the financial subordination of emerging markets and developing economies. So what I want to kind of stress is that the financial plumbing is embedded in structures of power. Since the collapse of the Bretton Woods, there's been a resurgence of private capital flows, and it's happened in basically three phases. You had the sovereign lending phase from 73 to 82, the capital markets phase which had basically two sub-phases, but was from the 89 to the financial crisis. And finally, the asset management phase, which basically is the post-crisis international financial system. Now, I want to look at the evolution of the interlinked mechanism of dollar liquidity and financial subordination in the way it was constituted and transformed through each of these phases. And clarify how the resilience of the global dollar basically derived from mechanisms that transmitted the burden of risk and adjustment to the periphery. So first phase. In this phase, the euro-dollar markets, which are basically dollar markets outside the US, it began in London. And, sorry. Sorry. So it began in the city of London with the first euro deposits, and it grew. And the US took a lead in forestalling any regulation of this market. And to manage this market, basically, because it was a private market going through offshore, banks originally in the city of London. But these are basically official dollar deposits and swap lines of the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, basically kept this lubricated this mechanism. And this became a major channel for recycling oil surpluses after the oil shocks in 1973 and 79. So surpluses were channeled through euro-dollar markets, and they went to developing deficit oil importers in the south, and who took loans. Now, these loans took the form of syndicated loans, and US money market banks coordinated these loans, and these were tied to the federal fund rate. And this was the hook which brought the global south into the web of global finance in the post-war world. The loans in the beginning were cheap. It was like a bonanza. And 9 major US money center banks were basically responsible for bulk of this. So 60% of the exposure was in Latin America. And they held about Latin American debt amounting to about 176% of the capital. Things went great until they didn't. And the hike of interest rates by Volcker in 1979 triggered a debt crisis. The external debt to GDP ratios rose. Their share of external debt owed to private sector banks in Latin America again jumped up. And the structural power of the creditors' cartel, these syndicated banks, the IMF and the World Bank and the US state were brought together to negotiate how this debt would be managed. And the goal was to ensure uninterrupted payments as a basis for restructuring. And this is very unlike the 1930s when moratoriums were extended to Latin America when they had the last debt crisis. And since the negotiations happened separately with each debtor state, they were basically in a weak bargaining position. And this became the wedge for introducing debt conditionality through structural adjustment loans, and was the basis of what's been called the Washington Consensus, basically the liberalization reforms as a policy agenda. This opened the floodgates for global capital markets. The next phase, which is the private capital lending phase. So the earlier phase was sovereign loans. This is a new phase. And again, before the capital flows kind of revive, you have to have coordination at the top, at the core. And here the Plaza Accord of 1985, the Louvre Accord of 1987, which is basically the key, the top 5 central banks got together to negotiate an orderly depreciation of the dollar, and then to put basically a ceiling on it. So it was central banks getting together to manage the dollar, or being enlisted in the management of the dollar. With the Brady Plan in 1989, which was basically a way of repackaging loans, the syndicated loans, which had now become non-performing and were close to default, they were re-engineered as tradable bonds, and the principal and the interest payments was collateralized against US Treasuries. Again, US Treasuries, safe asset, and this meant a greater demand was placed on US Treasuries as a collateral for these Brady bonds. And with this, more liquidity was kind of imparted to sovereign debt markets. Bond markets came back in the picture, and the creditor base was widened to include investment banks and institutional investors. There's a greater role for short-term foreign currency debt. So there's an expansion also in this period from Latin America to Asia, and the borrowers were also more was not states, but largely banks. Banks became an important part of the borrowers. It was more diversified. Derivatives were used as a form of credit enhancement to improve the marketability of these bonds. And this led to credit and asset bubbles, growing leverage, eroding margins of safety. It was basically a bubble which was ripe to be pricked. And we saw the tequila crisis when Mexico kind of had its currency crisis in 94. You had the Asian crisis in 97. And again, in these, in the aftermath of these crises, the US Fed, along with the IMF and World Bank and other central banks, played a critical role in the bailouts, in ensuring that debt repayment happened. And this led to what's called the post-Washington consensus. This was based on reconfiguring domestic financial systems, uniform practices, standards, and prudential regulations being kind of disseminated. And developing countries their financial system became more integrated and aligned to the rules of global finance. So this experience of crisis and bailout, including in countries which thought they had been model economies, had very strong fundamentals, really left a bad taste and was very humiliating for a lot of these countries. And in the aftermath, these countries, especially in Asia, started stockpiling reserves, which was predominantly dollar reserves, as a buffer, further supporting global dollar mechanisms while attempting to insulate themselves from the volatility of financial flows. Now, with this, and in this period, the reach of global finance also spread to Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And there was a big kind of focus on using financial markets to engineer safe and liquid private assets globally, what's been called the Americanization of finance. These rules of securitization and collateralization as a way of giving a boost to the financial system. So with this, global liquidity became linked to powerful global cycles tied to US monetary conditions and a risk factor proxied by the VIX. So monetary conditions of the US, so basically think of global financial cycles growing and contracting with the rhythm in the financial sector. Think of that as the heart, which is pumping. Every time it contracted, funds were kind of withdrawn from the rest of the world. And this is called the first phase of global liquidity, which is based on global banks. And the LIBOR which is the interbank lending rate, was the risk-free anchor for derivatives and securitized products. European banks played a key role as a round-tripping channel for financing. So basically, they were funding mortgage-based securitization in the US. So wholesale money markets funded these banks, and these banks funded the subprime mortgages in the US. Everything came crashing during the global financial crisis of 2008. There's a reversal of capital flows to the EMDCs. There's a dollar funding squeeze on European banks, and you had the Eurozone crisis. We enter the third phase. The crisis had shown the fault lines of the global dollar. And you had the extraordinary unconventional response of the US Fed. A key part of this was swap lines. These were a tiered institutional infrastructure to support the global lines. Key central banks would give each other dollar liquidity. You also had the new Basel regulatory regime, basically taking advantage of the regulatory exemptions they faced. Asset management funds became very important, and a new wave of debt builds up, which is larger, broader, and wider. This is the second phase of global liquidity, and now it centers on bond markets. You have really complex, interconnected, market-based channels of global dollar funding, right, which are developing. And to just give you a flavor, I mean, US money market funds are the source of the money, and banks, pension funds, and non-financial institutions in emerging markets are the borrowers. But to reach there, you have to go through this whole complex chain. It involves non-US repo dealers, it involves asset managers, central banks in different parts of the world, and global banks. So it's a very complex chain. Two important developments in this area in this period. One, non-financial corporations are borrowing through their offshore affiliates. So in Asia, Asian NFCs are borrowing, and they were borrowing to fund not investment in productive capacity, but short-term local currency instruments, a kind of a carry trade. And this was hidden from balance of payment accounts. Second, you had local currency bonds. I had talked about the original sin of borrowing in dollars. Now, identifying that as the problem, countries began borrowing in local currencies. But the exchange rate risk didn't go away, because now what it meant was you had every time their currency is depreciated, funding would dry up, because the risk is now on the investor's balance sheet, and they kind of basically back off when there's a depreciation. So there's increased sensitivity to bond markets to exchange rates. And you have the financial cycles, which I talked about earlier, are now becoming more intense. And the risk factor, which was linked to the VIX, the volatility index earlier, is now better proxied by the dollar index, which means if the dollar index rises, if there's appreciation, there's going to be a dry up of funding to the rest of the world. Okay. Foreign exchange swaps and repos have become really important in this period as a mechanism of getting dollars. And in recognition of this changing financial landscape, the LIBOR has been displaced by the securitized overnight financing rate, because that market is where the action is. So in this phase, the burden of risk is borne by developing country central banks. They are market makers of last resort in the currency and bond markets. They have to protect the exchange rates. They've also been enlisted in what's called the New Wall Street Consensus. So they've been enlisted in the whole enterprise of generating new investable assets to satisfy this insatiable thirst for financial returns, and attract global investors by taking on the risk. Okay, so this is called the New Wall Street. This is the New Wall Street Consensus, and you can again in the pandemic response, when the Fed intervenes to strengthen swap lines, it initiates a new FEMA repo facility, which allows central banks who have who hold U.S. Treasury securities on their balance sheet. It allows them to swap them for dollars, basically. Yeah. Now, this was an attempt to create inject liquidity when the world was reeling from the pandemic. But for developing countries who were indebted and were facing an exodus of capital because of the pandemic, they didn't have they didn't have access to the Fed swap lines. They were not able to access the repo facilities because they didn't have this big stockpile of US treasuries, which they could swap. They were outside the safety net, and they were left in the lurch. So you can see that the system is hierarchical, the safety net is hierarchical, there's unequal access to dollar funding. So this is basically summing it up. You have these three phases: syndicated lending, capital market lending, and the asset management phase. In each phase, you see cooperation at the core. Through the BIS swaps in the first phase, the Plaza and Louvre Accord in the second phase, the Fed's response and the institution of central bank swap lines in the asset management phase. You also see the liquidity mechanisms evolving. Euro-dollar markets tied to the Fed fund rate in the first period, shadow banking tied to the LIBOR in the second, and a broader market-based finance and the emergence of the SOFR as the anchor in the asset management phase. The form of capital flows to EMTCDs also changed. It was primarily syndicated loans to sovereigns in the first phase, Brady bonds, short-term foreign currency assets, largely to AMGC banks in the second phase, and finally the bond market, with local currency debt and non-financial firms becoming key borrowers in the third. In each phase, you saw fragility. Each wave of capital flows ends in crisis. You had the 80s debt crisis, you had the tequila crisis, Asian crisis, Russian crisis, and the great financial crisis, which kind of brought the second phase to an end. And then we had the post-pandemic debt crisis, and which is still evolving. You also had modes of disciplining the periphery, the Washington Consensus, then the post-Washington Consensus, which was basically rejigging. The Washington Consensus was liberalization, opening up. Post-Washington Consensus focused on prudential reforms in order to rejig the financial systems. And the Wall Street Consensus is when you have the de-risking state, who's taking on all the risks of the global financial system on its balance sheet. And financial subordination also, you see, from the beginning phase of liberalizing and opening up to getting tied up to global financial cycles, which move with the rhythm of monetary conditions in the US, and finally to more intensified cycles tied to the dollar index. So the financial mechanisms of dollar liquidity are tied to the dominance of US-led finance. And the Achilles heel of this is that excess financial elasticity engenders excessive risk-taking and gives kind of fuels speculation. But the key thing is that the boot, if the heel is elasticity, the boot, which is the burden of risk and adjustment, comes to fall on developing countries who have the liberalized, restructured domestic financial system in these countries amplifies elasticity of payments while absorbing the impact of discipline and funding when the buildup of systemic risk and fragility triggers a crisis. Financial subordination has a key role in the resilience of the global dollar. And to end, in a recent BRICS meeting, Lula raised the question, who was it that decided that the dollar was a currency after the disappearance of the gold standard? Who decided that our currencies are weak, that they don't have value in other currencies? And now we know. Okay, thank you so much.
Incredible. Thank you very much, Ramaa. That was incredibly insightful and interesting. I feel like I've learned a whole lot just listening to that small section. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. For all of the audience, then now is the opportunity to put in any questions that you might want to pose. Feel free to open up the Q&A section and just type your questions in there. And while we're getting those through, I'll just start with a few of my own, if you don't mind. Kind of following on from that conclusion. I guess one of the things that I wanted to know your viewpoint on was kind of looking at that asset management phase. How do you think that that will develop over the next few years, and what would you envisage being the characteristics of another phase after that potentially?
Yeah, it's always hard to kind of predict the directions of, you know, a changing landscape. I mean, all I know, all I can say is things are changing, and I think already when we're talking about the current kind of the debt crisis, there are two aspects to it. One is that unlike the earlier ones, asset management funds are one of the big, I mean, these non-bank are big investors. So there's private investors who are not banks, and the other is China. So the resolution, and there's been a lot of talk about a common framework, how to deal with this, and already those steps have been taken. I think how it emerges, it depends on a lot on geopolitics and the kind of responses developing countries come from. So if they are able to kind of weld a coalition, a kind of regional cooperation. I mean, the BRICS Bank was seen as something which could change the balance of power. But I mean, before things started to go wrong with that. So I think a lot depends on that, because on one hand, asset management funds are becoming stronger and stronger. I mean, the whole kind of in infrastructure, they have incredible sway. They are involved in I mean, they already control kind of through common ownership large chunks of the corporate world, and now the developing country infrastructure. So they're very powerful. They're going to lobby very hard. They have evaded the too big to fail kind of regulations. So basically, I think that the key thing depends on, are we able to regulate them on one hand to basically tame this impulse towards financialization, and are we be able to create coalitions that reconfigure the subordination? And third, since I've kind of, I think I've been trying to show that the subordination is related to global dollar mechanisms, can countries, or developing countries in particular, find alternative ways of generating liquidity, which is not tied? I mean, that is what Lula's kind of plea is. We need to, and China has tried to kind of create alternative dollar alternative paths, but this is all work in progress, and it's.
And do you think there is scope for these kind of increased regional financial institutions and greater regional cooperation to have a tangible impact on that?
I hope so. Yeah. So it basically depends on kind of being able to kind of step back from national kind of focus to see that, okay, this is, I mean, the thing about this is a global good. International liquidity is a global good, and it has to be managed collectively. Otherwise, it creates. So once that's recognized, I think we have a way forward. And one of the kind of things being proposed is to have a larger role for special drawing rights, something which is already there, or create something similar, because one is not saying replace the dollar with another currency. One is saying have a truly, have something which is more multilateral, or at least which gives developing countries more room to maneuver. Because in the present system, they are at developing countries are at a disadvantage. They have less access to funding, and they have more expensive access to funding.
And I guess China's the real kind of sticking point here, if you like, really. What do you envisage of the kind of the outcome of them kind of increasing internationalization of their renminbi, the ideas such as the Belt and Road Initiative? Do you feel like even the idea of kind of having less of a US hegemony and more of a kind of bipolar system, do you think that's beneficial or even feasible, really?
Uh, we're quite far from a bipolar system in the sense that um, the US is so far ahead. I mean, in terms of from even the euro, which is its second, the second contender, and China, though it's really grown in its international footprint, is really small in terms of reserves, payments, debt. Yeah, and so I mean, and this is, I guess, the sticking point. Unless there is a I mean, so the US has to recognize that the dollar is not going to remain, which means a loss of exorbitant privilege. China, who's, I think, the whole kind of initiative to internationalize the renminbi, which got a big push, especially after 2014, has again kind of stepped back, given the kind of financial up and downs it has been having. It's pulled back, but it's also it's also kind of contending with the failure of some of the debt which it had been giving. It had been extending to developing countries, particularly in Africa. So it's, I mean, all this upheaval, I think, I mean, I'm optimistic because when there's upheaval, there's scope for, some reform. But there's also the danger that chaos results. So I guess it's basically important for economists and other policy people to actually sit together and convince, that, okay, there has to be a collective solution. We need to have regional cooperation as kind of a buffer against the dollar hegemony, as it were, and build ways of providing liquidity that which doesn't depend on the global. Yeah.
Great, thank you. A question just come in from someone there relating to what we've just talked about. Isn't it so? They've said, isn't it true that several countries recently went into bankruptcy due to predatory lending terms from China?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I mean, now when you think of countries like Sri Lanka or Pakistan, which had this big, which have been in the news a lot, China and non-bank asset funds, they're both very heavily implicated. And yes, China, the Chinese lending played a big role. I mean, you had these huge infrastructure projects which were complete white elephants, which basically backfired. And I think China is having to reckon with that and find out how to resolve the debt crisis. But yeah, but it's not true that it was just China, and the role of these asset management funds in countries like Sri Lanka or Pakistan also needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah.
So it's true, but it's not the whole picture.
Okay.
And which is why, I mean, as I said, at each phase things change, and these two developments are key developments in the debt crisis in the current period, because they also mean that, like I think I'd mentioned how in after the first debt crisis in '82, the resolution it was a coalition. You had the World Bank, IMF, US money market banks, and the US state, a very coherent creditor, I mean, in negotiating. Things have become much more complicated because of this, because you have to get both China and these private non-bank institutions on board, which is much more messy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great, thank you.
Mhm.
And another question coming in. What is it that's stopping these BRIC nations collaborating with the new currency? Is it to do with a political standpoint or is it to do with the uncertainty? Just wondering, as recently India and the UEA have agreed to use local currencies for cross-border transactions.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so you had this big, a lot of, I mean, there's been this increase in these kind of arrangements of using local, I mean, of it began with trade. I mean, a lot of trade is invoiced in dollars. So now to, countries instead of invoicing in dollars and have local currency trade agreements or investment treaties denominated. All this is basically kind of chipping away at the central importance of the dollar. I mean, its dominance. But the big hurdle is kind of geopolitical in some senses. How long will this kind of that you have to and the fact that you have to move beyond bilateral arrangements to something which is more multilateral. The thing about international funding, there's a network externality. The more you use one currency, the more other currencies hitch on, and you have to think of the global financial system as a network. Now, bilateral kind of exchanges do play a role, but you have to also see the big picture. And historically, it's a currency which has dominated because it's been at the keynote of key center of finance. I mean, in the heyday of the kind of British Empire, it was the City of London and sterling. But now it's dollar and but financial centers are are dispersed, even though they are still hitched to the dollar. I mean, some of the biggest dollar transactions happen in the city of London, right? So what I'm trying to say is that this system, I mean, you need to have a kind of, um, I mean, more than bilateral agreements to actually make a big difference. But these do play. And the thing about uncertainty, the reason why the dollar remains is precisely because we live in an uncertain world, and climate change has added one more layer of massive uncertainty where you need a safe asset. And so far, dollar is it, which was a complaint of of Liu Ping, right?
Great, awesome. Thank you again. Just another one for me, actually. I just wondered if you would be able to compare the manner in which financialization has impacted kind of like South America compared to some of the Asian countries, for instance, and if there's anything that we can learn from those experiences.
Okay, so I think the big thing is like especially after the Asian crisis. I mean, countries like Korea, there have been I mean, different countries, sorry, so let me back. Different countries follow a different pace in terms of liberalization and that whole package. Two, they have different degrees of, I mean, different configurations of the way the state manages its local financial system, its domestic actors, and its external. So for Korea, for example, in the initial financial liberalization phase, there was this there's a viewpoint or analysis which suggests that the state was trying to use the entry of opening up as a way of disciplining the shyballs, right? So you have, I mean, your domestic political coalition plays a big role. And there is, I mean, and central banks and states can also use policy to limit, let's say, how vulnerable the country is to these global rhythms through capital controls, through kind of it things which actually directly limit what banks can do through sometimes through public ownership too, right? I mean, of course, that China is at an extreme in the sense of the way the state clamped down. I mean, it was walking this tightrope of liberalizing because it needed to do so to internationalize the renminbi, but the state was also very, very strong in trying to prevent, I mean, in clipping the wings of finance. I mean, so I mean, there has to be a kind of a path between these extremes of completely saying whatever finance does and allowing it to call the shots and directing it. Because, and some states have, I mean, especially in Vietnam, Korea, have been more effective in dealing with that. I mean, Argentina has been a roller coaster. Every time they attempt, then the debt crisis hits them and they're back on the, yeah, so.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
And moving on to a slightly different topic, I guess. Obviously, there have been issues with the way that structural adjustment programs, for instance, have been implemented. What reforms do you think would be necessary to the IMF, to World Bank, to better serve the interests of developing countries?
Okay, one, I think a big thing is SDRs. I think SDRs have to play a bigger role, and their distribution has to be not according to quotas, but according to development country needs. I mean, and climate change is also an important part of that. I mean, if you want to resolve global, I mean, the uh, the unequal impacts of climate change and the polarizing impact of financialization, you have to distribute the SDRs and make them more available, and more available to the least developing countries first, and and the most vulnerable countries first, and ensure that. I mean, so I think that is a big thing. Second, this whole there has to be a recognition that the private finance is inadequate to the task. It has to be, I mean, if you let it go on its own, I mean, the institutions are too big, their horizons are very short term, and they're the business of making quick returns. So it's very hard to reconcile that with the needs which we are facing, which means you have to step in and kind of, and it's not just regulation, it's also things like size, things like which sectors do you go into. There has to be some more direction and more public ownership of the direction. And one problem with public ownership is, I mean, let's say, this whole post-Bretton Woods thing period was marked by this idea that state failure is the big harm, right? And before that, the interventions of developing states was because market failure was seen as the big harm. After the financial crisis, financial markets failure is now being recognized, and one has to address that. I mean, it's not state versus market. It's how to harness financial markets in a way which work more equitably.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. I've saved maybe the biggest question for last then.
Okay.
One of the audience members. It's a very short one. Will Bitcoin replace the dollar?
Unlikely is the short answer, but I mean, so now the things about it's kind of Bitcoin was launched in the wake of the financial crisis as kind of a counterpart to this. I mean, the financial crisis, the big banks and the Federal Reserve were seen as the big actors and said, okay, we want to have a system which doesn't have intermediaries, which doesn't depend on the authority of the state or big banks, right? That is the central idea. But but something like Bitcoin is much too volatile to be considered a safe asset, right? And it's that recognition which gave rise to things like stable coins in the cryptoverse. But you need something with a stable value to as an anchor for financial transactions. And Bitcoin doesn't have it, but can a stable coin have it? Again, ultimately, it depends on mechanisms that that stabilize it. Now, the crash of, the Terra Luna stablecoin, altcoin kind of twins. Now, so basically show that, okay, here was a stable coin which was linked to an algorithmic gyration of its twin coin. Other stable coins are linked to basically things like the dollar. So ultimately, they depend on the conventional market. So you can't get away from it if you try to stabilize. If you use algorithm, it's much too unstable. And that's the thing about finance. It needs when things start to go south, you need a kind of a lender of last resort, a collective, or a collective action kind of thing to piece it back together, to basically give extend a safety net, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, when the crypto markets were collapsing last year, earlier we had the white knight was it was Friedman, Bankman Fried, right? And now look what happened.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great, amazing, thank you. We are reaching the end of the session. If you don't mind, there's two good questions that have come in. If you could just give a very, very short answer to those.
Okay.
Last one being the freezing of the Russian dollar. Did the freezing of Russian dollar funds post-Ukraine fundamentally change the view positively or negatively across the world of having the dollar as a stable currency? And the second one is, do you recommend any books that we can read related to this?
Okay. So the freezing of dollar funds, it is, again, it shows you how the dollar can be a weapon, right? You don't need to, it's kind of the power of the sanction. But it also, it didn't, I don't know about positively or negatively in that sense, but what it did a kind of trigger, for example, again, is countries kind of suddenly becoming alive to the fact that, okay, we have dollar reserves, but they could disappear. So we may need to think of this. You still need the dollars, but you start exploring other channels, right? But I don't think it's it's an. I don't think it did clarify something about the nature of the dollar hegemony. Definitely, yeah. Books, okay. Related to this. So, if this talk, the whole idea of the key currency approach, which I was talking about, and Kindleberger, there's a really lovely, nice new recent book by Perry Merling on the global dollar, which is a good place to begin.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
I think it's called Money and Empire, the dollar, Kindleberger and the dollar, something. Yeah, but it's called Money and Empire. Perry Merling.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is great fun.
Excellent. I'm glad. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a hell of a lot. So
Okay.
that's it.
Okay.
Thank you, Rama, and thank you to everybody else who have joined.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening in. Yeah.
Indeed. As it's 2 minutes over, I'll let you go. But thank you very much for taking the time out today, Rama. I really appreciate
Thanks.
it.